What happens when a duchess who has spent years at the center of global headlines steps onto a stage ruled by Britain's sharpest tongue? The answer, on this night, was not the polite exchange millions expected, but the first rumblings of a confrontation that would spiral far beyond control. The studio lights blazed hotter than usual, flooding every corner of the sleek black set with a brightness that left nowhere to hide. Shadows stretched long across the floor, exaggerated by the polished shine of the desk that anchored the stage. Behind it sat Piers Morgan, the veteran broadcaster whose reputation was built on never backing down, never softening, never blinking first. He adjusted his tie with deliberate precision, then shuffled the note cards in front of him, not because he needed them, but because ritual steadied the hands before battle. Piers leaned toward the camera, his trademark smirk cutting across his face like a razor hidden behind charm. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but carrying that undercurrent of steel that made even casual remarks sound like cross-examination. "Tonight, we're joined by Meghan Markle, actress, advocate, former Duchess of Sussex. She's here to talk about her journey, her work, and her views on the choices that have shaped her life." The words were polite enough, but even in that opening line, there was a subtle edge. "Former Duchess" landed with a faint weight of dismissal, the reminder that she had stepped away from a crown she once wore. The audience responded with polite applause, though if you listened closely, the rhythm was uneven. Some claps were enthusiastic, others half-hearted, and the mixture created an odd, uncertain energy in the room. From stage left, she appeared. Meghan Markle. Her entrance was calculated to the millimeter. Draped in an ivory silk blouse tucked beneath a tailored charcoal blazer, she moved with the precise composure of someone who had practiced this walk, this smile, this entire moment in her head 100 times before stepping onto the stage. Her heels clicked crisply against the floor, the sound sharp enough to echo faintly in the gaps of applause. Her hair, styled in cascading waves, shimmered beneath the bright lights as if each strand had been positioned by design. She smiled, warm enough for the cameras, but small, measured, and entirely controlled. Her eyes, however, betrayed something different. They flicked briefly across the audience, then to the cameras, checking angles, noting reactions, before settling on the man who waited for her. A smile without warmth, eyes that calculated. Already, the atmosphere had shifted. Piers rose from his chair as she approached, extending his hand with the formality of a judge greeting a defendant. "Thank you for coming," he said smoothly. "Of course," Meghan replied in that familiar polished tone, her voice calm but carrying a faint sneer if you listened closely. She slipped into the chair opposite him with practiced elegance, crossing her legs precisely, adjusting her blazer lapel in one fluid movement. Then she flashed another smile, perfectly camera-ready, perfectly rehearsed. "It's always good to clear up the endless confusion about me." That line landed like a first strike, polite on the surface, but with a sharp suggestion that confusion wasn't her fault, but the fault of those who misinterpreted, or perhaps deliberately twisted, her story. The audience chuckled lightly, though the laughter was uneven. Some found it charming, others stiffened at the arrogance tucked between the syllables. Piers chuckled politely in return, though his eyes didn't soften. "Well," he said, leaning forward just slightly, "let's see if we can clear that confusion tonight." The stage was set. Two figures sat across from one another, the polished desk between them not just furniture, but a battlefield. On one side, Meghan Markle, posture straight, hands folded neatly, exuding poise sharpened into armor. On the other, Piers Morgan, jaw firm, eyes locked, the very picture of polite hostility. The camera panned slowly across the scene, catching every flicker of expression. Meghan's lips curved faintly upward, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed a readiness to strike. Piers's smirk was still there, but thinner now, sharpened, as if already preparing to counter. The energy between them was visible, not just felt, a charged current running through the set. For a long moment, nothing happened. The audience barely breathed. Piers tapped his pen once against the note cards, then set it down deliberately. Meghan shifted slightly in her chair, not fidgeting, but making the kind of small adjustment that said, "I'm perfectly at ease, even when I am not." And then Piers broke the silence. His voice was calm, even casual, but his words were the spark to the kindling. "Let's begin with the obvious," he said. "Your decision to step away from the royal family. Do you see it as liberation, or do you regret it?" The question hung in the air, simple but loaded. Every head in the audience tilted forward, waiting for her answer. The control room hushed, hands frozen over switches. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Meghan tilted her head, a soft smile curving across her lips. "Liberation," she said finally, her voice silky and measured. "Absolutely. Regret is for people who stay trapped. I chose freedom." The audience stirred. Some nodded in admiration, clapping lightly. Others stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances. The word trapped lingered heavily, echoing through the studio like an accusation hurled across oceans. Piers scribbled a note, though he didn't need to. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. He had his opening. Already, the duel had begun. The word freedom still reverberated through the studio like the chime of a bell struck too hard. Meghan's lips remained curved in that faint, satisfied smile, the kind that said she believed she had landed her opening blow. For a beat, silence clung to the room. Then the audience murmured, a few scattered claps, a couple of disbelieving gasps, and the low, uncomfortable hum of people unsure whether to cheer or recoil. Piers Morgan leaned back in his chair, fingers laced loosely in front of him, his expression unreadable. His smirk had faded, replaced by something subtler, sharper. He studied her with the stillness of a chess player staring at an opponent who had just sacrificed a pawn, curious whether it was careless or calculated. "So," he said slowly, each syllable deliberate, "you see the monarchy as a trap, not as a duty." The question landed softly, but everyone in the room knew it was a hammer dressed in silk. Meghan let out a light laugh, one that carried no mirth. She tilted her head just slightly, as though amused by the simplicity of his framing. "Well," she said, her voice laced with sugar and steel, "playing dress-up for the tabloids isn't exactly what I'd call duty. Waving from balconies doesn't change lives." Gasps rippled through the audience, louder this time. A nervous chuckle escaped someone in the back, but it was quickly smothered by the sharp intake of breath from the front row. The comment wasn't just dismissive. It was dismissive of centuries of ritual, of tradition, of people who still believed in crowns and scepters and balcony waves. Peasy's pen hovered over his notes, then lowered. His grin tightened, though his eyes gleamed with the first flash of irritation. "Interesting perspective," he replied, voice calm but edged. "Though William and Kate seem to believe those duties have meaning. Would you say they are wasting their lives?" Meghan shifted, not with discomfort, but with the calculated grace of someone preparing to strike. She crossed one leg over the other again, her blazer catching the light as she adjusted it. Then her smile sharpened into something closer to a smirk. "If they find fulfillment in being ornamental," she said evenly, "good for them. Personally, I prefer relevance." BA snapped. A louder murmur coursed through the room, rising like a wave before breaking into scattered gasps. Even the band in the corner, silent witnesses to countless interviews, exchanged uneasy glances. The word ornamental carried venom, and everyone knew it. Peasy's fingers tapped once against the desk, his composure straining at the edges. "Ornamental," he repeated, his tone flat but loaded. "That's quite a description of your brother-in-law and his wife." Meghan shrugged, feigning indifference. "If the shoe fits." The audience reacted audibly now. Some whispered furiously to one another. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension, once simmering, was climbing fast toward a boil. Piers leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet," he said, voice measured, "you benefited from the very system you now criticize. The titles, the platform, the global attention. Do you believe you owe it any respect at all?" The question hung heavy in the air, sharp and deliberate. Meghan's smile faltered for the briefest second before returning, thinner this time, her eyes flashing. She leaned forward, too, closing the distance across the desk. Respect, she said, her tone cool, is earned, not inherited. If anything, I gave them a splash of relevance. I brought change. And yes, color, too. The final word detonated like a grenade. Gasps erupted across the studio, this time louder, sharper, almost scandalized. A few audience members even clapped, not in approval, but in that awkward, knee-jerk way people sometimes do when stunned. Piers' eyebrows arched, and for a moment, his composure nearly cracked. His jaw clenched, then loosened. Color, he repeated softly, his voice tight, his pen now forgotten on the desk. Meghan didn't blink. She held his gaze with defiance, her chin lifted just slightly higher, as though daring him to challenge her. For a long moment, the two sat locked in silence, one smirking, one stealing. The cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of expression, every twitch of a jaw muscle, every narrowing of eyes. Then Piers spoke, his tone carefully measured but his eyes betraying the storm building behind them. Strong words, he said. Let's pivot, then. He shuffled his notes deliberately, a gesture of control, though the paper in his hand crinkled under the pressure of his grip. You've spoken often about privacy, yet you've given interviews, produced documentaries, published a book. Critics say you embrace publicity when it suits you and decry it when it doesn't. How do you respond? It was the first hard pivot, the first strike in a new direction. But Meghan didn't miss a beat. She leaned forward, her eyes glittering, her tone shifting from silky to sharp. I'd say people like you, she began, her words slicing the air, need to learn the difference between privacy and secrecy. But I suppose if you understood that, you wouldn't have made a career out of harassing others. The jab landed like a blade to the gut. The audience reacted instantly. Gasps, whispers, even a muffled "oh my God" from somewhere in the middle rows. The energy in the room shifted from tense to electric, every eye darting between the two figures on stage. Piers' smirk vanished completely. For the first time, his jaw tightened visibly, his hand flattening against the desk. But when he spoke, his tone remained calm, low, clipped, and dangerous. Well then, he said quietly, each word deliberate, this will be a fascinating evening. The words were not reassurance. They were warning. And with that, the polite mask of the interview shattered. What had begun as civil discourse was now a duel, the first sparks already flying. The air in the studio grew thick, heavy with anticipation. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or prepare for the explosion they knew was coming. Two figures, seated across from one another, locked in a silent war of wills. Meghan, poised and defiant, her words sharpened into weapons. Piers, outwardly calm but simmering with irritation, his questions honed to Piers. The stage had shifted from conversation to confrontation, and everyone watching could feel it. This was no longer an interview. It was a battle, and it had only just begun. The hum of the cameras seemed louder now, as though the machines themselves sensed the storm brewing. The audience sat stiff, shoulders tight, eyes darting between the two figures at the desk. No one shifted in their seats. No one dared to cough. The air felt thick, as if charged with static. Meghan leaned back slightly, her blazer catching the light in sharp angles. Her smirk had returned, faint but deliberate. She had landed her blow, accusing Piers of making a career out of harassment, and she savored the sting it left behind. Piers, however, wasn't retreating. His pen lay abandoned on the desk, his note cards half forgotten, but his eyes burned with a new focus. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, sharper, as though he intended every word to cut. You say privacy and secrecy are different, he began, leaning forward slightly, and yet you've given some of the most watched interviews of the decade. You've released documentaries, written a memoir, even narrated podcasts about your life. If that isn't inviting the public in, then what is it? Meghan's smile flickered, but she held his gaze. She folded her hands neatly on her lap, the picture of poise, though her eyes glittered with defiance. It's called agency, Piers, she said, her tone deliberate, almost rehearsed. I decide what I share, when I share it, and how I share it. That's not hypocrisy. That's control. And the fact that bothers you says more about you than it does about me. The words dropped like stones into a pond, their ripples spreading through the studio. The audience reacted audibly, low murmurs, a few gasps, the shifting of bodies leaning forward. Piers's jaw tightened. He pressed his fingertips against the desk, steadying himself. His smile returned, thin and humorless. Agency, he repeated, his tone flat. So when the coverage is flattering, it's sharing. When it's uncomfortable, it's harassment. Convenient, isn't it? Meghan's smirk widened, though the sharpness in her eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. No, Piers, she countered. When I choose to speak, it's authenticity. When you and people like you twist my words, it becomes exploitation. That's the difference. Gasps broke out again, followed by uneasy laughter from the corners of the room. The tension was no longer simmering. It was boiling. Piers leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. His eyes never left hers. Exploitation, he said, the word dripping with skepticism. That's rich coming from someone who's turned her life into a media empire. Netflix deals, book deals, podcasts, public appearances carefully staged. You criticize the press, yet you've become the press. You sell your story as much as anyone else. The jab landed hard. Even the crew behind the cameras exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. Meghan leaned forward now, closing the space between them. Her smile vanished, her expression hardening into a mask of controlled fury. The difference, she said slowly, enunciating each word, is that I tell my own story. I don't let people like you define me anymore. That's not exploitation. That's survival. The room froze. Her voice carried an edge so sharp it sliced through the silence. Piers's lips pressed into a thin line. He tapped the desk once, then leaned forward to match her posture. Their faces, though separated by the width of the desk, felt locked in a duel across inches. You call it survival, he said, voice low, steady. But to millions watching, it looks like opportunism. It looks like you walk away from an institution, call it toxic, then spend years monetising the very thing you claim destroyed you. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended mid-swing. The audience reacted instantly. Gasps, mutters, one sharp clap before being drowned out by the murmur. Meghan blinked slowly, then tilted her head with an almost mocking softness. Ah, yes, she said, her voice rising just slightly. The old she's cashing in narrative. Funny how no one accuses men of that. But when I claim my space, suddenly it's opportunism. Suddenly it's scandal. Her voice grew sharper now, the polished calm slipping into something fiercer. You don't like that I refuse to be silent. You don't like that I tell my story instead of letting you tell it for me. That's what this is about. Not hypocrisy. Not exploitation. Control. Mine, not yours. The audience gasped again, this time louder, like a collective intake of air before something shatters. For the first time, Piers's expression cracked. His eyes narrowed, his jaw flexing visibly. He inhaled deeply through his nose, then exhaled slowly, as if reining himself back. His voice, when it came, was calm again, but the steel within it was undeniable. Control, he said softly. Yes, Meghan, you have control tonight. You've chosen your words carefully. You've sharpened them into weapons. But let me remind you, this isn't Instagram. This isn't a podcast. This is live television. And here, people can see through performance. The line landed like a thunderclap. The audience erupted. Gasps, whispers, nervous laughter all colliding into one chaotic noise. Meghan's face tightened. Her hands, still folded, clenched slightly against each other. For the first time, the mask of poise seemed to slip at the edges. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, before replying. Performance, she said coldly. No, Piers. Performance is pretending to care about people's pain, so you can get ratings. Performance is turning human suffering into cheap headlines. If anyone here is performing, it's you. The studio went dead silent. Not a murmur, not a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Piers sat still, His eyes locked on hers, his body motionless save for the faint tightening of his fists against the desk. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the tension coil tighter and tighter until the room felt ready to snap. When he finally replied, his voice was calm, but low, clipped, and dangerous. "Careful," he said softly. "You're not just insulting me. You're insulting everyone who works to bring stories to the public. People who don't have your platform. People who don't have your millions. People who don't get to walk away from responsibility and call it survival." It was a line that drew both gasps and applause. Chaotic, fractured, but loud. The studio had become a battlefield. Every word a volley, every pause a landmine. Meghan leaned back again, her lips curling into a thin, defiant smile. "Then maybe they should choose better stories," she said. The words were final, cutting, dismissive. The audience sat frozen, the weight of the exchange pressing down on them like a storm cloud. The duel had escalated. The polite veneer was gone. This wasn't just about privacy anymore. It was about power. Who had it, who defined it, and who would claim victory under the blinding lights of live television. The lights seemed to harden, as if the studio itself had chosen a side. The earlier exchanges had stripped away courtesy. What remained were nerves, bare and buzzing. Somewhere beyond the lenses, millions watched with held breath. In the room, you could feel it, the sense that the next topic wasn't just a question. It was a fuse. Piers lifted a fresh card, then set it down without looking at it. He didn't need prompts for this part. His voice, when it came, was steady, anchorman calm with courtroom weight. "Let's talk about your husband." The shockwave moved through the audience like a low, rippling sound. Meghan did not flinch, but the angle of her chin sharpened, as though she had been expecting the blade and decided to meet it head-on. "Harry," Piers continued, "was raised by an institution that many in this country still revere. The public remembers him as the young man who walked behind his mother's coffin, who served in uniform, who smiled on balconies, who seemed, in spite of everything, to love his family. Since leaving, he's been described as distant, angry, isolated. People wonder if he's been cut off by choice or encouraged to cut off. Do you take any responsibility for that?" Meghan's smile sharpened into a line. She folded her hands, each movement precise, controlled. "Harry is a grown man," she said evenly. "He makes his own choices. The world loves the fantasy that I whisper in his ear and move him like a chess piece. It's not only insulting. It's wrong." Piers nodded, but the nod wasn't agreement. It was permission to continue. "And yet," he said, "people close to the family, friends, staff, those who knew him before, say the change is drastic. The laughter is rarer, the calls shorter, the visits fewer. They say he has traded one palace for another, one with walls built out of resentment." There was a soft, collective intake of air. Meghan's eyes flashed, but her voice remained cool. "What they call resentment," she replied, "is what happens when someone wakes up. When he understands that duty can be an excuse for cruelty." "Cruelty," Piers repeated. "By his father, his brother. By a system that rewards silence," Meghan countered. "Pick whichever face you need to justify the mechanics." The words, deliberately imprecise, slid through the room like ice water. Piers leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "You know what millions are thinking," he said, the softness gone. "They are thinking, if you believe the system is cruel, why keep discussing it? Why keep publishing? Why keep profiting from it? If peace is what you wanted, why feed the chaos?" The question landed with a thud. Meghan did not look away. "Peace," she said, almost whispering, "isn't quiet. It's honest. We've told the truth. That's why it's loud." Piers let the beat hang a second longer than comfortable. "Some would say," he murmured, "you've told your truth. And you've told it over and over again." Meghan's smile returned, brittle and bright. "And yet you're still asking, aren't you?" A smattering of uneasy laughter clicked through the audience like pebbles hitting glass. Piers ignored it. "Let's make it simple," he said. "Harry's relationship with his brother. Is there a path back? Or do you prefer the estrangement because it proves your point?" The room tightened. Meghan's eyes narrowed a fraction. I don't prefer pain, she said. I refuse to pretend it's love. Is it love? Piers pressed. To cut family out? To torch bridges in books and cameras? To speak of reconciliation while selling the story of the split? Meghan's posture straightened further, as if steel had been slid into her spine. Is it love? She shot back. To brief against your own, to leak, to smee, to hide behind courtiers and headlines. Don't ask me about bridges while they are still holding the matches. Piers leaned in, the space between them collapsing into inches of air and a mile of meaning. Do you hear yourself? He asked quietly. You talk about honesty while assigning malice wholesale. Father, brother, institution, anyone who doesn't orbit you on your terms. That isn't honesty. That's conquest. The word detonated. Even the cameras felt closer, the red lights hotter. Meghan didn't blink. What you call conquest, she said, is what happens when someone stops apologizing for existing. And what you call existing, Piers said, the ice back in his voice, looks a lot like punishing the people who once loved him. For the first time, something flickered in her expression, a shadow, faint and fast as a shutter. She breathed in, a measured inhale, then leveled him with a stare that matched the weight of the lights. You weren't there, she said. You didn't sit in those rooms. You didn't hear the things said quietly because they're always said quietly. You didn't see the costs. Piers did not soften. You are on television, he replied. You wrote the costs in hardcover. You filmed them in 4K. And still you say we don't understand. Perhaps we understand too well. Another beat. The studio was a drum tightened to the edge of break. Meghan didn't move. You want a confession, she said. I want accountability, Piers said. For what? She asked. For his happiness. For the collateral, Piers answered. That single word, collateral, hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't lift. Somewhere, a light hummed. Somewhere, a pen clicked. The silence felt judicial. Meghan's voice came quieter now, the edges sanded but not softened. The collateral existed long before I arrived, she said. Broken boys grow into angry men when they're told their hurt is tradition. I didn't create that. I refused to feed it. Piers stared at her for a long moment, and whatever he was thinking did not reach his face. When he spoke again, he chose a different door. Let's say we accept that the institution failed him, he said. Why keep speaking about them? Father, brother, grandmother, if healing is the goal. Why summon their ghosts every time a camera appears? Meghan's reply came without a pause. Because silence protects the powerful. And because every person told to keep quiet becomes the next cautionary tale. Or the next franchise, Piers said, and the words were colder than the lights. There was no laughter now, no gasp either, just the slow, painful exhale of a room realizing a line had been crossed, and that there were more lines left. You talk like a confessor, Meghan said, the mask back in place, radiant and unyielding. But you're a businessman, and you're angry that my business no longer requires your approval. Piers didn't blink. I'm angry, he said, that a family is being used as scaffolding for a brand. And I'm angry, she answered, that a family used a boy as a symbol and called it love. They stared at each other, two statues carved from different kinds of stone. If one of them had smiled, the spell might have broken. Neither did. Piers reached for his cards again, not to read them, but to lay them down like a judge returns a file to the clerk. He shifted slightly, shoulders squaring, voice lowering until the microphones caught only the words and none of the mercy. Final question on this, he said. If the phone rang tonight, and it was his brother, no cameras, no staffers, just a voice you both remember from before all of this, would you tell him to pick it up? Meghan didn't answer at once. A dozen possibilities flashed behind her eyes, each one weighed, measured, dismissed. When she spoke, the syllables were smooth as glass. I would tell him, she said, to answer every call that doesn't demand his silence. Piers watched her a beat longer, as if testing the weight of that sentence in his hand. Then he nodded once, recognition, not agreement, and straightened fully. Then let's move, he said, the words like a gavel, from family to image. Because some would argue they are the same thing. The room exhaled. The fuse, for now, had burned to its knot. But the smell of it, the singed, invisible thread of what had just passed, remained. And from somewhere you couldn't place, backstage, or inside one of the cameras, or perhaps in the mind of every person watching, came the certainty that the next segment would not simply spark. It would ignite. The cameras refocused, pulling in tighter, as if the directors sensed the ground underfoot was shifting from fragile to fractured. The tension that had filled the studio after the family clash hadn't eased. It had simply rearranged itself, coiled like a spring waiting for the next press. Piers sat straighter now, cards back in his hands, though his eyes hardly glanced at them. The audience could see it. This was no longer a man reading questions. This was a man circling in, choosing his moment. "Let's shift gears," he said finally, his voice smooth but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "You've spoken about freedom, honesty, and liberation. But you've also built ventures, documentaries, podcasts, book deals, that critics say look less like advocacy and more like a rebrand. They argue your charity work feels staged, more like glossy photo ops than genuine effort. How do you respond?" The air itself seemed to stiffen. Meghan adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal blazer, a small, precise motion that felt like both a pause and a weapon. "I respond," she said coolly, "by pointing out that when I was silent, I was accused of being complicit. And when I spoke, I was accused of being opportunistic. Tell me, Piers, which of those accusations would you prefer I accept today?" A few scattered laughs bubbled nervously from the corners of the studio. They weren't happy laughs. They were the kind that people make when they realize they're in the middle of a storm. Piers's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I think," he said evenly, "viewers would prefer clarity, not contradiction." "Clarity," Meghan repeated, letting the word roll in her mouth like a stone. "That's funny coming from you. Your entire career thrives on fog. Fog of outrage, fog of moral superiority. It's convenient, isn't it, to criticize others for seeking platforms while you build your empire by doing exactly the same." The audience stirred again, caught between admiration and discomfort. Piers let the words hang, then leaned forward just slightly, his fingers lacing together on the desk. "I'll take the fog," he said, voice low but steady. "Because unlike you, I don't sell sincerity in high definition. You talk about honesty, but to many people watching, it looks like branding. Every cause, every partnership, every carefully lit photograph, it looks less like compassion and more like strategy." Meghan's smile flickered but held. "You mistake professionalism for performance. Women are always accused of calculation when they dare to be competent. And men are accused of arrogance when they refuse accountability." Piers shot back instantly. "We all wear labels. The question is, are yours deserved?" A hush fell, the studio pressing in closer. Meghan tilted her head, her expression controlled, but the sharpness in her eyes betrayed her irritation. "Let me ask you something, Piers," she said. "When was the last time you actually did something for charity without a camera? Or do your good deeds only exist when the red light blinks on?" Piers didn't flinch. He let the insult pass, his silence heavier than any comeback. When he finally spoke, the words were weighted. "I'm not the one here who turned philanthropy into content." The audience gasped, louder this time. A few even clapped, then stopped, realizing applause in this moment might carry a verdict. Meghan leaned forward now, her composure polished but her voice like a knife sheathed in silk. "What you call content," she said, "I call visibility. If cameras capture the work, it amplifies the cause. If my presence draws attention, that's impact. Isn't that what influence is for?" Piers shook his head slowly, almost sorrowfully. "That depends. Is the cause the headline? Or are you?" The question landed like a gavel. Meghan's lips parted, then curved back into that tight, defiant smile. "Maybe both," she said. "Maybe it takes a name to wake people up. And if my name does that, then I won't apologize for it." The air was heavy enough to choke on. Piers tapped the edge of his notes against the desk, not looking down, but never breaking her gaze. "Some would call that admirable," he said quietly. "Others would call it vanity dressed as virtue. Which one do you think history will decide? Meghan's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. History? Please. History is written by people like you. Biased, bitter, determined to reduce me to a caricature because you can't stand a woman refusing to play by your rules. The words sliced, but Piers didn't retreat. His jaw flexed once before he answered. No, Meghan. History is written by deeds. And no amount of PR polish changes what people see when they look closely. There was silence now. No murmurs, no coughs, just the stillness of a room caught between admiration for the courage of bluntness and fear of the fallout it might cause. Meghan uncrossed and recrossed her legs, her blazer catching the studio light in quick flashes. If people look closely, she said, they'll see a woman who survived, who thrived, who refused to be swallowed whole by an institution that devoured others. That's not vanity. That's survival. Piers nodded once, slow, deliberate. And if people look even closer, they'll see the collateral damage. A family in pieces, a brother estranged, a father alienated, a country divided. Meghan's tone dropped to a razor's whisper. Maybe they'll finally see the truth, that families who trade loyalty for silence were broken long before I arrived. The words lingered, venomous and poised, as if daring him to swat them down. Piers inhaled through his nose, then let the breath out slowly, visibly holding on to control. Then let's strip it bare, he said, his voice tightening. Do you believe the work you're doing is primarily about charity, or is it about control? About controlling how you're seen, how you're remembered, how you're framed? The question carved through the set. Meghan didn't blink. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his, and answered with chilling calm. Control, she said. Because if I don't hold the pen, people like you will write the story for me. And I refuse to live inside your narrative. The admission hit like thunder. Gasps rattled across the studio. Sharp, uncontrollable. Even the cameras seemed to quiver. Piers absorbed it, sitting perfectly still, his face unreadable. Then, at last, he leaned back, setting his cards flat on the desk. Thank you for your honesty, he said softly, though the steel hadn't left his tone. Because now, at least, we know exactly what this is. Meghan smiled, a smile too sharp to be warm, too polished to be spontaneous. And what is that, Piers? She asked, voice dripping with mockery. A performance, he said, one you've perfected, but the mask always slips. Tonight, millions just watched it happen. The lights above hummed. The cameras zoomed in. The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was explosive in its restraint, like the pause before glass shatters. And for the first time, the thought whispered across the room like a draft. This wouldn't end with applause. It would end with a fracture. The studio had reached that dangerous stillness, the kind that doesn't feel like calm, but like the pause before thunder splits the sky. Every light above glowed hotter. Every camera lens seemed to sharpen. And at the desk, two figures sat locked in a duel that no script could soften anymore. Piers had listened, absorbed, endured. His face remained outwardly composed, but his fingers drummed once against the desk, a tell that the patience reservoir had nearly run dry. He leaned forward, no longer pretending this was an interview of equals. Meghan, he began, his voice calm but laced with steel, we've talked about family, about duty, about your work, your words. And throughout all of this, there's been one consistent theme: deflection. Everyone else is cruel. Everyone else is complicit. Everyone else is to blame. Never you. Meghan's posture stiffened. She crossed her arms, her smile brittle, daring him to continue. And now, Piers pressed, his voice rising a notch. The question is no longer about monarchy or media. It's about accountability. Do you take any? Or is the world forever wrong and Meghan Markle forever right? The words landed with the weight of a gavel. The audience shifted uneasily, but not a sound rose. Meghan leaned forward, her tone deceptively calm, her eyes glittering like glass under fire. My accountability, she said, was refusing to stay silent while people like you pick my bones clean for ratings. My accountability was surviving an institution that would rather see me broken than free. I don't owe you, or anyone else, a performance of guilt to make you feel better. Piers' jaw flexed. He tapped the desk once, then set his palms flat, as though anchoring himself. This isn't about making me feel better. This is about millions of people who once believed in you, who wanted to embrace you, who mourned with you, who thought you would be different. And instead, what do they see? A woman who walks out of one palace and builds another, this time lined with cameras and contracts. The air bristled with the impact of the accusation. Meghan didn't blink. Instead, she let out a sharp laugh that cut the silence like shattered glass. "Oh, Piers," she said coldly, still clinging to the fantasy that the public owns me. "They don't. They never did. That's what drives you mad. You can't stand that I walked away and still thrive without your approval." For the first time, Piers' composure cracked. Barely, but enough. His smile thinned, his eyes narrowing. He leaned closer across the desk, his voice dropping into something colder than anger. "What drives me mad," he said slowly, "is watching you use pain as currency. Watching you weaponize family fracture as brand equity. Watching you stand here and sneer at everyone who dares to question you, while insisting you're the victim." The words detonated. Meghan's eyes widened a fraction before narrowing again, her arms tightening against her chest. "You want a victim, Piers," she hissed. "Look in the mirror. You've built an entire career feeding on resentment. I'm not here to soothe your bitterness." The clash rang like metal on metal. The tension became unbearable, a living thing pressing against the walls. Crew members behind the cameras glanced at each other nervously, unsure if they should be preparing for a cut to commercial. Piers didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his voice lower now, but each word precise, like arrows shot deliberately. "No, Meghan, you're here because you wanted another stage, and you've mistaken this one for your Instagram account, thinking you can filter, edit, and curate your way out of scrutiny. But this isn't a feed. This is reality. And in reality, not every critic is a hater. Some of us simply see the pattern." Meghan's voice turned icy, every syllable honed. "The pattern is that men like you will always bristle when a woman refuses to bow. You want me small, manageable, grateful. That's not who I am. Get used to it." The studio crackled with electricity, as though the air itself might ignite. Piers' patience snapped, not in volume, but in tone. "Small," he shot back. "You think this is about making you small? This is about respect. Respect you demand but never extend. Respect for the people you've dragged into the spotlight without their consent. Respect for the audience who sees through the endless contradictions. Respect for the legacy you've twisted into a shield." The words hung heavy, the atmosphere thick as a courtroom moments before sentencing. Meghan's lips curved into a smirk, but it didn't mask the fury burning beneath. "Respect," she repeated slowly. "Funny. The people who preach it the loudest are always the ones who gave me the least. Because respect is earned." Piers snapped, the calm veneer fully gone now. "And all you've shown tonight is arrogance, entitlement, and contempt. You've mistaken defiance for strength, disdain for truth. But the mask slipped, and everyone watching has just seen it." Gasps rattled through the studio, sharp and uncontrollable. The red lights on the cameras seemed to pulse brighter, capturing every second of the implosion. Meghan leaned back, her voice dripping with venom. "You've wanted this moment for years, haven't you? The chance to scold me on live television, to crown yourself the righteous judge. Congratulations, Piers. But remember this. History won't remember the bitter old man behind the desk. It will remember the woman who refused to break." The insult struck, heavy and deliberate. A stunned silence followed. Even the lights seemed to buzz louder, filling the void. Piers inhaled, then leaned in with finality. His voice was calm again, but it was the calm of a storm after destruction, the calm that signals nothing is left standing. "History," he said quietly, "will remember what you've revealed here tonight. Not the brave survivor you imagine, but the arrogance, the deflection, the refusal to take responsibility. And when the books are written, when the cameras fade, what will remain isn't the brand. It's the wreckage." The words were final, immovable. Meghan sat frozen, her smirk faltering at the edges. And then came the moment, the crack, the decision, the line crossed. Piers straightened, lifted his notes, and set them down as if closing a case file. He looked directly at her, then at the camera. This interview is over. The declaration hit like a verdict. The audience gasped, some clapping instinctively, others stunned into silence. Meghan's eyes widened before narrowing into slits. Slowly, she unclipped her microphone, each movement deliberate, defiant. She rose from her chair, her blazer catching the studio light. "Well," she said coldly, her voice carrying across the silent set. "At least now everyone sees the real Piers Morgan. Predictable, petty, bitter." Piers didn't rise. He met her words with calm steel. "And they've seen the real Meghan Markle. Defensive, entitled, and utterly incapable of grace." The studio erupted, not in cheers, but in gasps and half applause, a chaotic mix of shock and release. Meghan spun on her heel, her footsteps sharp, echoing across the polished floor. The cameras followed her as she strode toward the exit. The heavy studio door closed behind her with a decisive, echoing click. Silence. Piers adjusted his tie, turned back to the camera, his face composed once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of finality. "Sometimes live television doesn't just ask questions. It answers them. Tonight, you've seen all you need to know." The red light blinked, the broadcast cut to black, and the moment was already destined for replay, dissection, and headlines around the world. The door's faint click still echoed like a gunshot in the cavern of the studio. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had been vacuum-sealed, the air sucked out by the sheer audacity of what had just transpired. Meghan Markle had walked out, not in a carefully staged exit with a polite smile and handshake, not in the graceful cadence of a guest concluding their segment. No, this was a storming departure, an implosion, and everyone in the room felt it. The cameras stayed trained on the empty space she had vacated, the red sofa still warm from her presence. A single microphone cord dangled awkwardly across the cushions, left behind like evidence at a crime scene. Crew members in the shadows exchanged panicked glances. Do they cut to commercial? Do they hold? Do they zoom in on Piers? Every instinct screamed for order, but nobody wanted to miss a second of history being made live. Piers remained seated, perfectly still. His fingers smoothed the edge of his notes as though nothing at all had happened. His face betrayed no triumph, no satisfaction, no smugness, just the stony composure of a man who had made a decision and was determined to stand by it. He didn't even look toward the door she had vanished through. He kept his gaze forward, locked on the audience, the cameras, the nation. The audience, meanwhile, was restless. Some sat frozen, jaws slack, trying to process what they had witnessed. Others clapped in short bursts, unsure if they were applauding Piers' authority, Meghan's defiance, or simply the fact that they were part of a moment that would be replayed on every network within the hour. A woman in the front row whispered, "Oh my God," and her neighbor simply shook his head, eyes wide. The red tally light above the primary camera blinked insistently. Live, still live. Millions of viewers sat at home, leaning forward in their living rooms, hands clutched over mouths, phones buzzing with incoming texts from friends and family. "Are you watching this right now?" Piers finally moved. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and leaned toward the camera with a slow, deliberate calm that felt more dramatic than any outburst could have. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low and resonant, "you've just witnessed something extraordinary. I invited Meghan Markle here tonight to have a conversation, a chance for honesty, for reflection, for clarity. What we received instead was evasion, derision, and insult. And when the questions became too difficult, she chose to walk away." His words echoed across the silent studio. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel beneath his calm made every syllable strike like a hammer. He continued, "This program has welcomed presidents, prime ministers, Nobel Prize winners, and ordinary people with extraordinary stories. Some agreed with me, some didn't. Some liked me, some didn't. But all of them, every single one, stayed in that chair and answered questions with dignity. Tonight was different. A ripple of applause began, hesitant, then growing. Some audience members leaned in, clapping harder now, grateful for the cue. Others still looked unsettled, unsure how to react. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had simply shifted, heavy and lingering. Piers let the applause fade before he spoke again. His tone softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. I know some of you watching may agree with her. I know some of you think I was too harsh, too relentless. But let me ask you this. What is the role of an interviewer? To sit quietly while the guest spins a fairy tale? To nod politely while contradictions pile up? Or is it to ask the questions that millions at home are already shouting at their screens? The audience murmured approval now, the unease slowly turning into a kind of collective catharsis. Piers leaned back in his chair, folding his hands calmly. Meghan wanted control. She wanted to decide what could be asked, what could be answered, what narrative would survive. But control is not the same as truth. And tonight, truth mattered more. In the control room, producers exhaled audibly, some with nervous laughter, others already drafting headlines in their minds. The feed was gold, pure and unfiltered. Whatever fallout came tomorrow, tonight's numbers would be seismic. Back on stage, Piers glanced once at the abandoned microphone on the sofa, then back to the camera. For those of you who tuned in expecting polite small talk, I apologize. For those of you who tuned in hoping for candor, well, sometimes candor doesn't look the way you expect. Sometimes it walks out the door. The audience chuckled, the tension breaking at last, though it was laughter edged with disbelief. Piers offered the faintest of smiles. Let's take a short break. When we return, we'll discuss what happened here tonight and what it means when accountability collides with arrogance. Live on A. The cameras pulled back as the theme music swelled. The red tally light went dark. And yet, even as the broadcast cut to commercial, the studio remained abuzz. The audience leaned toward one another, whispering furiously. Some clutched their phones, already composing tweets. Crew members hurried across the floor, murmuring into headsets, adjusting lights that no longer seemed relevant. Behind the curtain, in the corridor, Meghan's heels echoed against the linoleum as she strode toward the exit. Her jaw was tight, her fists clenched around her clutch. Assistants scurried at her heels, unsure whether to comfort or retreat. Her face betrayed nothing but fury, though in her chest, her heart hammered with a cocktail of rage and adrenaline. Already she was rewriting the narrative in her head, already framing herself as the wronged party, already plotting her next move. In the studio, Piers remained seated, alone now, save for the crew and the murmuring audience. His eyes lingered on the desk for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't triumphant. He was resolved. He had drawn the line. And no matter what tomorrow's headline screamed, he knew the clip would play forever. Piers Morgan tells Meghan Markle to leave his set. When the cameras blinked back to life, the studio would look calm again. But nothing about this night was ordinary. It was history, raw and unscripted, carved in real time under merciless lights. And the world would talk about it for years.